For joining me today. Now, what is the reasoning behind this trip for Trump? Is he trying to clean up some messes? I mean, this is just on the heels of his announcement about Syria, and is that also why he made the comments about Israel?
Right. I think very clearly is following his very controversial decision to pull out from Syria and the criticism that he was basically letting the Middle East being taken by Russia and by Iran. I think here he's sending a clear message that America still has troops in Iraq and does not intend to let the whole region being taken over by hostile powers. And of course the comment on Israel, which is, I think, intended more at his electoral basis back home to the evangelicals, to say, you know, there's been so much criticism saying, how can you pull out from Iraq and let Israel, deal by itself with the threats in Syria, including from Iran? And here he's saying we're still behind Israel, also mentioning the money issue, this $4.5 billion, by the way. When he says giving, this is not charity. This is money that Israel is using to buy American military hardware. So, but he really talks like a businessman at the end of the day when he said we're pulling out of Syria because it's costing us a lot of money and we're giving a lot of money in Israel. He talks a lot about money.
Well, speaking about money and about funding, while in Iraq, Trump also said he doesn't want wealthy countries to ask the United States for money to fund their militaries. So let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Wealthy countries cannot expect the United States to pay for a vast majority of their military. They can pay us. They can reimburse us. There's nobody has a military like us, but we're all over the world. We're spread out all over the world. We're in countries that most people have never even heard about. And frankly, it's ridiculous. So that's the story. It's very simple. I wanted to come to Iraq. I wanted to meet these great heroes. And that's what we're doing. And that's why we're here.
Well, this also goes right along with him saying he no longer wants the U.S. to be the policeman of the world. Are we seeing some kind of a policy shift? Are we going to see the U.S. becoming less involved in conflicts around the world?
Well, this is something he's been saying all the way. I mean, even during his campaign. And by the way, he said wealthy countries. I mean, he also mentioned countries that nobody has ever heard about. I'm not sure which one he meant. But when he said wealthy countries, he meant mostly members of NATO and European countries. And he does have a point, saying these are wealthy countries and they should meet the target of NATO, which is to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, which most of them don't. So I think this is actually a very legitimate point, and even the European leaders recognize it. They just say, well, it's really hard for us to spend more money because we're short of money, but we will, don't worry. They agree on the principle. They agree that they should spend more money on their defense and not rely entirely on the United States. So when he said wealthy countries, he meant the European countries, the members of NATO. When he meant countries nobody has ever heard about this, you'll have to ask him.
Well, let's talk about the secrecy surrounding this trip to Iraq. What kind of a security risk is it for the President of the United States to be in Iraq at a time like this?
It's a very high risk. Obviously, in Iraq, you have all those terrorist organizations. You have forces very faithful to the Iranians that would be happy to, get rid of the U.S. president. And you have also jihadists. You still have a presence of the Islamic State that has not been completely eliminated. Not only in Syria, by the way, when Trump said, we've done the job in Syria, IS is out. It's not entirely true. You still have a couple of thousand troops in Syria, but also in Iraq. Iraq is still a very dangerous country, a very unstable country. And of course, it was very well advised for him to keep this trip secret ahead of it.
I want to go back to Trump's comments about Israel. Are we seeing Trump take a step back from Israel? Are we seeing a broader step back from U.S. support for Israel?
I don't believe so. I think that at the end of the day, I mentioned before that Trump is a businessman, but he's also a politician.
Definitely.
And he intends of running again. And he knows that a large part of his support in America comes from the evangelicals. I think his decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem was very much influenced by his willingness, by his concern of keeping the support of the evangelicals. And I think that his support for Israel is very connected to his political calculations, which makes sense for him. So I wouldn't expect him to stop supporting Israel or change his policy on Israel. And he said it himself. He said, we'll always support Israel. Of course, he mentioned the money, saying, and you should say thank you. he thinks everybody should say thank you. You know, he said all these European countries that, get a free ride should say thank you and should put more money. I think he expects also Israel to say thank you, but I don't think we should expect him to say from one day to the other, we're not supporting you anymore.
Do you think Netanyahu is surprised by his comments?
I think that he was making a point. He was making a point which, if I would put it, in a simple manner, is like, stop whining because you're getting a lot of money from us. You're doing a great job defending yourself. It's not because the U.S. pulled out its troops from Syria that you should be worried. And by the way, Netanyahu himself has been very careful in his comments and his reaction to the decision of the U.S. president to pull out from Syria. He hasn't gone out of his way to condemn it. He's been very careful. And most Israeli political leaders, definitely from the government, have been very careful in their reaction to the decision of the U.S. president.
I want to touch on Afghanistan really quickly. There had been rumors that Trump was also going to reduce the amount of troops in Afghanistan. Does that look like it's going to happen as well?
It looks very likely. I mean, when he, again, I would guess that when he said countries that people have never heard about, he probably meant Afghanistan, even though now, people have heard about Afghanistan since 9/11. But if he pulled out from Syria, based on an economic calculation, it would make sense, according to the same logic, to pull out from Afghanistan. If you say it's costing us a lot of money and I don't see the benefit, I think we should expect it.
Well, we'll have to wait and see what Trump does next. Emmanuel Navon, thank you so much for your insight.